one of the ways in which I entered the field was actually during my PhD on Victorian women's literature. I was Deputy Head of Education at Wandsworth Prison, and that was then quite a high security prison, and my students were primarily young black London-born men. Most had dyslexia, many were victims of abuse, many had drug addictions, and so my literature classes were actually GCSE and also basic literacy. And the only text they could study on GCSE about black experience was To Kill a Mockingbird. So I thought back in the 90s, this seems to be a bit strange. So I started to investigate who might be some black British writers. And those who were born in Britain were actually the generation that was starting to publish, people such as Courtier Newland. And I got him into the prison to speak to the men because his book The Scholar had just come out. And then via the yoga teacher, I got Linton Kwesi Johnson into the prison. And so we became quite a cultural unit. And the first time that a GCSE text by a black British author was offered, and all the men passed their GCSE. So that was pretty wonderful. And that sort of made me, I suppose, what you might say is a literary activist. Fred Degar calls me an activist scholar, but I'm determined to decolonise the curricula from a firm canonical foundation, and I'm hoping that this book embraces that kind of dynamic. Well, this book does have the starting point of 1945 in the title, but actually its reach is much further back, not only in my introduction where I look at the tropes of blackness and representation that go back to medieval performance techniques, and also the presence of Afro-Romano people in Britain long before Britain was actually an empire nation. It was a dominion of the Roman Empire. And so Sushil and Nasta's chapter also then in the 20th century sets the course for how we might view post-war literature as it's divided up. So the book is aiming to cover this sort of the inheritances, I suppose, historically of how representations of blackness have occurred in Britain as it became from 1707, and also the way in which that surge of people coming into the country post-Second World War forever changed the English language. I suppose, having been called a scholar activist, I was really quite aware of the way in which the critical mass about this field that emerged very much from the sort of post-90s had a quite tenuous footing in the institutions in Britain, be those schools or universities, and often the work is taught more outside Britain in universities than it is actually within British humanities. And so I thought it was very important to have some formal marking of the whole field. And as one of the important responses to decolonising the curricula, which is absolutely necessary to respond to generations who are asking for a diverser range of voices in literature and in the cultural exposure that they have at school and at university, this kind of book, I hope, will respond to that. And it's not definitive, it's not exhaustive. What it aims to do is to open up possibilities for further exploration. Members of the public or people in formal education hopefully will use it as a resource for that purpose. Writers whose provenance is from Africa and South Asia have had an immeasurable effect on Anglophone literature. It's absolutely, I'd say, something that's refashioned the way in which we even conceive of the English language and its uses, the imaginary landscape that can be drawn upon, what we hear, so the sound of various poetics, whether it's formally in the theatre on stage, whether it's spoken word, whether it's on the airways, whether it's in readings of prose. These have taken away this expectation that was very much post-war, if we're thinking of the period of the book, that there would be a certain kind of English spoken publicly. And these liberationist poets, as are referred to in the book, they started to challenge what might be the expectations of what can be heard publicly. And that inheritance was then, of course, carried on right up until now. And it's an absolutely extraordinary heritage for British writing and for British literature. And it's actually something that the MA in Black British Literature that I co-convene works on, because we need to embrace that in terms of education and what people are exposed to in literary culture. I think it's a question that's very close to decolonising literature in terms of how British Black and Asian literature will define the future of literature as a taught subject and as a cultural happening. I think too that the fact that the Edexcel exam board will be launching their new A-level in English literature with the Black British list followed by a British Asian list is going to mean that young people will be educated with that as an expectation, and furthermore that teachers will also in a way be encouraged and, if needed, given some education in how they might access the work and teach it. And so this companion will be a vital accompaniment, I hope, to that. And so the future for British Black and Asian literature is, as with any body of literature that's coming out in Anglophone writing, it's bright, I would hope.